Anyway, Noah asked me if I talk about grazing technologies, and I was starting to think about. I do go around the state, and I've given quite a few talks on precision livestock, precision agriculture, kind of things like that. And so I try to think about, okay, well, where does this fall with range? And I think one of our main things that we talk about and you see is GPS collars. So I'll talk quite a bit about GPS collars. Some of the things I'm going to present to you today might be more applicable from a research side versus a necessarily range management side, at least right now at the price of technology. But I still wanted to throw that out there and show you guys some of the things that are going on. And so as Noah mentioned, a Montana State University Extension beef specialist here on campus. I'm one of two beef specialists in the university system here. My background is a lot to do with grazing livestock management, grazing livestock or grazing beef cattle nutrition, especially those that incorporate large expansive rangelands in their operations. And so part of my PhD program, and then as part of my job in general, I try to stay up to speed with a lot of the technologies that are out there and coming, which can be pretty tricky sometimes because it seems like the technology is coming faster than I can keep up with it. But nonetheless, it's actually a really interesting time to be in beef cattle production systems and rangeland with some of the things that are coming up. So like I said, from the aspect of technology, when we think about beef cattle production and rangelands, one of the first things that pop up in people's minds is grazing distribution, grazing use, and how that relates to technology. I'll talk to you about in a second, but I just threw some background bullet points here that grazing distribution is a very critical component of cattle management on rangeland. Grazing distribution equates to use and sensitive areas, things like that. We've also found that cows within the same pasture can have very different grazing patterns, which is interesting, and that mechanisms that influence grazing distribution can usually be classified into a couple factors: the physical environment, such as topography, forage resources, maybe thermal environments. But then there's also these things like individual animal attributes, so spatial memory, age, experience, and how do those play into how an animal distributes on the landscape. And there is some technology out there where we've really been able to expand our knowledge and our ability to measure some of these things on rangelands. But before I get into the GPS stuff, there's a component that I think is really important to think about, and that is the use of accelerometers. This is a technology that I feel has taken not just the livestock industry by storm, but just everyone. So you think about a Fitbit, an Apple Watch. I think Garmin has some trackers out there. All these activity trackers, our phones or cell phones, if you have a smartphone, has an activity tracker in there. That's how they're able to track steps, or how to track if you've been exercising, or how to track these different activities you've been doing. I know my wife got me an Apple iWatch a while back. And one of the first things that kind of creeped me out about it is I got in my pickup and started driving down the road, and I got this notification saying that we recognize you're driving and silenced your phone for you to eliminate distraction. And I'm just there going, how in the heck does this watch know that I'm driving? And it's because of the accelerometers or activity sensors, especially in conjunction with GPS and what that can do for these animals. But without the GPS piece, accelerometers or activity sensors have quite the application in the beef cattle side of things, management specifically. And so we've seen where these activity sensors have been incorporated into ear tags, smart boluses. And so I don't know if my pointer is working, but if you look at this cow here, you can see this white ear tag with the blue button on it. I think that's an Allflex activity sensing ear tag. And so what they do is they put those activity sensors in there. This one down here, we'll talk about this real quick too before I talk about how the data impacts beef cattle production. But This is a bolus that you put in these animals, and then that bolus can record activity as well as temperature and rumen pH on like 10-minute basis. It doesn't have to have a base station that it reports out to, so the animal has to be within so far that base station within a few, we have used these on rangelands, but those animals have to usually come within that base station and download that data in order to get that real-time stuff. But the whole point being is the dairy industry has really taken some of this activity sensor stuff on, and they're utilizing it for heat detection. So essentially what they're finding out is they can create an algorithm that basically creates an animal's baseline activity over the course of however long it's there. And then they're searching for spikes, activity spikes, like that animal, is that animal being ridden? Is it riding? Is it eliciting things coming into heat? And we know that usually when an animal's coming into the heat, it becomes a little more active. So that activity piece comes into place. And I know there's a bunch of SRM folks in here, so I've actually seen some presentations on this next bullet point, illness. I know Dr. Derek Bailey's done some work trying to capture some of this, but there's been others too that in the opposite realm of things is if we use these activity sensors to set that animal's baseline and we start seeing depressions in activity, the animal's becoming less active. Some of the data out there is showing that they can pick up animal illness days before a pen writer or somebody might actually see visual symptoms of that animal, which has some big cattle production application. One of the big things right now that these companies that produce these ear tags are really trying to capture now is calving events. Can they capture when an animal is calving with these ear tags? So essentially what would happen is if you had all your animals and your heifers or your animals in the calving lot, rather than necessarily having to go out there and check them every hour, every couple hours, you could have these ear tags could essentially send you an alarm or send you a text or a whatever have you, and let you know that that animal is in the process of calving, and then you can go and check on that animal. I will warn you all, I think this is upcoming technology. I think it's going to be very helpful in the beef industry. I think there is some rangeland application here, especially looking at grazing behavior, since these activity sensors are relatively cheap compared to a GPS collar. But most of these algorithms that are available in these companies were based on dairy outfits. And so it's not that it doesn't cross over to beef, but there needs to be some work to dial in these activity algorithms and these activity measurements for a beef cattle herd. So keep that in mind as you're out and about and you see some of these things, is that it could be good. It hasn't been validated very well for beef, and some of the results that we've seen haven't been great for beef in terms of detecting behavior with these systems. What happens when you put that technology into a GPS collar? And so this is where it really starts looking into some range expansive management systems and having some serious application. And so what I like to show people is this is a map of a pasture, and each of those dots within that pasture is a GPS location. A lot of our previous research, guessing probably, 90s, early 2000s, things like that. This is kind of what you saw. You see dots on a map. It shows where that animal was. But there's one critical thing that is different when we incorporate an activity sensor is now, if you remember my example of having my Apple iWatch knowing what I was doing, we can look at not only where those animals were, but what they were doing when they were there. And so a lot of the research that I've been working on, and I know Noah's been a part of and is working on, is not just looking at general distribution or general occupancy of a pasture, But let's tame that down and pull out grazing events. And where are those grazing events happening in the pasture? Because I feel like really when we start talking about animal distribution and animal impacts on landscape, we're talking about the impacts of that animal in a grazing location or its utilization across the pasture, and how can we implement management strategy to get better distribution across the pasture, and maybe not have or identify some hot spots where these animals like to congregate, and things like that. So that's what adding an accelerometer to a GPS collar has really done for us in the research world. The other thing that I really like, and this isn't necessarily new technology, it's been utilized for a little while, kind of in the wildlife side of things, but I think has potential or huge potential impacts for management on the livestock side, is the use of these relative use maps. And so when I look at a pasture here and I see all these dots, you know, I can kind of get a view of where the animal hangs out a little bit. I can see, okay, well, there's more dots here, but once you get so many dots, they overlay on each other and you don't really know where's the true hot spots here for these animals. And so what relative use maps are is essentially taking that pasture and then putting it on a graph, and then basically making a three-dimensional graph on the volume of GPS locations within a given area. And so a lot of our research, we use 30 meter by 30 meter resolution. And so basically it's just calculating how many GPS locations were in that 30 meter by 30 meter location, and creates this these peaks and valleys. And then what we can do with that is transpose that into a heat map, and we can look at what the real relative use of that pasture is, and we can find where are the hot spots, and how big of a hot spots are these, what's the distribution really like out there. And with that technology is another mechanism that we've been beginning to use too, where once you know that relative volume, you can calculate, well, what percentage of the grazing locations were in this area. And so in this particular example, I think I asked the algorithm to populate a pink ring around 50% of all grazing locations. And so that's what that pink ring is. So you can see the hot spots of where the animals were. Plus, we know that that animal spent over, or at least half its time grazing in those specific locations within those polygons. So when I think about rangeland application or information available for management decisions, this is something I think there's a lot of potential for, because this could inform maybe where you supplement, where you develop water, where you cross fence, if that's what you're up to, you know, things like that that can really inform pasture management. So we use that a lot in our research, and so I'm going to give you a couple examples here, and this is only part of the story. I'll get to the rest here in a minute, but they make really nice visual maps. And so this is a study we did over in Miles City, where we looked at two different supplementation types. One was just a protein self-fed feeder, and the other one was cake that was caked daily. And what we really found in this study, oh, and then year one is on the left there. And then year two, what we did is we switched which pasture got which treatment. But when we look at this, what we really found out in this study is that at least caking these, this was heifers, and at least caking those heifers every day, they didn't want to miss out on that cake. And so they stayed pretty close to the front end of the pasture because they didn't want to miss their opportunity to get cake that morning. Where it appears that the self-fed animals kind of used more of the pasture itself. This is a study that we did up in the Northern Ag Research Center when we were looking at relative feed intake or RFI, and how RFI might potentially impact grazing distribution on rangelands. And this was all done in late season, November through first part of January grazing. And keep in mind, this is only two individuals I pulled out for illustration, but what we were able to find here is just, you know, how do these different animals utilize the landscape different, and what does that mean? And what I did here, rather than just doing the 50, I created this dotted line, I don't know if you guys can see my arrow or not, but this dotted line that's right around those red hot spots is 50% of the grazing locations. The next one out, or the next topo line, if you will, out, is 70%, and then the largest one is 90% of all grazing locations. So you can really get a feel for how these animals are utilizing the landscape. And especially, like, for instance, this animal particularly with this had a high RFI rank, really only utilized a little piece of the pasture where this low RFI animal kind of hit both sides of that main draw. I will let you guys know that when we average this across all the high RFI and low RFI animals, we didn't actually see a true treatment effect, but I still think it's really interesting to look at least two different individuals that we had in this study. I should make a pause here and let Noah talk this figure, since it's part of his master's program. But one of the things that Noah is looking at and that we have an interest in is, what about supplementation and weather conditions? And so Noah went out and supplemented a group of cows 3 times a week. And so he looked at, well, how did distribution of those animals change from the day before supplement to the day after supplement? And then was that impacted by the weather conditions while those animals are out there? So cold, moderate, and warm. We haven't fully finished this analysis, I don't think. We're maybe when we're done with this talk, Noah can inform us if we're done and if he has anything other to say about it. But one of the things that we did see just from a visual aspect here is that weather and the day of supplementation does have an impact on animal distribution. Whether we can quantify that with the statistical models, I'm not 100% sure yet. Noah can let us know on an update on that one. What I really like about these maps, and I'm not gonna get too crazy in going through models and data with you guys. I thought you'd be more interested in just application. But what we can do is use some remote sensing stuff, and we can create these layered resource maps where we can say, okay, well, we calculated for this giant range pasture, we calculated that distance for water, we calculate across that pasture. We basically make these like this digital elevation map in the center here. You could do the same map for distance for water, or elevation, or slope, or topography, distance from supplement, and you can put all those maps in a stack and then stack your grazing distribution map on top of that, and then start looking at, using these computer algorithms, we can look at, okay, well, what factors are tending to impact the areas of use within these maps for each individual, and then we can run more advanced statistics on what that means for the whole herd level aspects. I thought that this would be a good point, since we're talking about layered resource maps, to talk about some other things that are interesting in the livestock grazing technologies, and that's the ability to monitor vegetation conditions remotely, or at least semi-remotely, and whether that's with the use of drones or satellites. I've been told, and as I work through this, that on a pasture level scale, satellites seem to be the resolution coming from satellites, the multispectral imagery and everything seems to be getting better and better every day, essentially, and that the coverage is getting to be once every day, or every couple days, or at least once a week. And so the ability to monitor changes in vegetation over time are becoming through satellites is coming something that could happen really soon. And so some of the potential applications for that is forage production. And I know some of you probably heard of the range analysis platform, where they've worked on creating some forage production models based off of satellite imagery. And so you can kind of get some baseline starts for when you're going out to set stocking densities or manage pastures. There's some opportunity for drones. I know there's quite a few people out there who really like to fly drones, and there's some real good application there. So I've heard of folks wanting to locate cattle with drones. One of the big things that we've talked to folks about is their ability to program and check out fly to water tanks. I had a producer contact me the other day to ask me if I thought that would be feasible, because there's a there's a water tank that you can drive as a crow flies. You can drive within a mile, but it takes half a day on horseback to actually get up in the rugged hills and get to that water tank. And so they were asking, is there potential for drones and looking at water and things like that? And I think the potential is there. But for some of these applications, it's not till recently that drone prices are getting cheap enough. I would say the general producer or manager would be interested in playing with them, but they are getting good. This isn't a range example, but I was talking to one of our precision ag folks the other day, and he said he knows producers that have gone and bought just personal drones that they use to check nozzles on pivots. And so they'll park their truck and run that drone down across the pivot and back and check their nozzles, and off on the road they're going, which has saved them a huge of time, because before they had to go walk the entire pivot, which some of those are quarter-mile pivots. And so there is some serious application there. But in terms of drone versus satellite, I think it really comes down to what level or what resolution you want to monitor things at. I would say for the general pasture or the general producer out there who wants to evaluate things like vegetation production across the pasture, the satellite's probably the answer. It takes a lot of battery power to map with drones. But if you're looking at more vegetative community or specific vegetation characteristics, the satellite resolution is probably not going to get you what you want, and the drone would be a better option there. This is another thing we use in research quite a bit. It's really a neat application. We've been utilizing these a lot, but they're not at a price point right now, I think, for the general producer or consumer. But with the way that technology is going and the way that technology seems to be getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, maybe sometime in the near future, it could be a pretty good opportunity. But really what these trailers are is they're designed to measure individual animal intake. And on top of that, they have gates on them, or the top one has a gate system. The bottom one has a little auger system with a hopper. But the way they work is the animal, you get on the computer and you dictate which animals get what nutritional program you want. So you can assign a certain protein supplement allowance for each individual based on some kind of characteristics. Maybe you want heifers getting 3 pounds, where you only want cows getting 1.5 pounds, something like that. But you can assign individual supplements and then these trailers allow us to monitor supplement intake as well as control it, in the sense that once an animal meets the program requirement that the requirement that you programmed for her, the top trailer has a locking gate system. So once she eats her allotment, it kicks her out and won't open the gate again until the next day. The bottom one has an auger system. So once she eats her allotted amount, that auger system turns off. And it works through EID tag readers, locking gates, and as long as you have cell service where you park these trailers, you get real-time data. So you could actually go in there and see animals eating real time. And from a research world, when it comes to looking at the impacts of different supplementation programs on animal intake, and then how that intake is, or their nutritional program relates to how those animals are moving across the landscape, these trailers have been a huge improvement to the methods of the past in doing these kind of research programs. Oh, I didn't realize there was animations on that, so I apologize. But this is not new technology, but I like to put it in here because sometimes I think we need to take a step back. And again, this one is strictly from a research standpoint, but the use of cannulated cows is a model to look at animal diets on rangelands. And And so this is an example of a study that we did out at the Red Bluff Research Center. And if you look in that center picture, I swear I'm not playing on my cell phone. I'm just using my phone to record that animal's bites. But what we do is we completely empty these animals' rumens out, so they are completely empty. And then we turn them out into our grazing treatments. And then we record all the bites they take in a 20-minute bout by species. And then after that 20-minute bout is done, then we pull that sample out, and then we'll send that sample out to or for analysis. So we'll look at, first of all, we'll look at foraging efficiency. How much did they eat in that 20 minutes? How many bites per minute, grams per minute? Then we'll dry it out and just look at and send it off for a forage nutrition lab to see what was the nutritional value of that diet. This study that's pictured here was actually a grazing post-fire. And so what we were doing is measuring animals' diets prior to animals being turned out to graze, and then after those animals graze, to look at the change in diet based on grazing, based on a couple different post-fire grazing treatments. Some other things, and I don't know how well these apply to rangelands yet, but some other things that are on the forefront in the livestock industry in terms of new technology is thermal sensor imagery, and that's being utilized in a lot of feedlots right now. That people are flying drones over thermal cameras or have thermal cameras over pins, and what they're looking at is identifying animals that are spiking temperatures as a health or a stress type response. I really like this picture on the top too, with that cow with the green light lit up ear tag. Again, that I believe that sensor has a thermometer in there, so it's measuring that animal's body temperature, and it's what it does is when that body temperature spikes, it turns red and identifies the pen writers that animal has a fever or is a temperature, and to check it. We've been doing some thermal imagery on rangelands, but it's been in the context of looking at heat of fermentation or different supplement nutrition programs, and how those interact with winter environments in that animal to maintain homeothermy. And so what we've done is actually put those internal boluses I mentioned earlier in there that are measuring the rumen temperature. We have a grad student that goes out there and takes thermal imagery, and then we're going to correlate that back to the winter environment and look at how the nutritional components and just affect those animals' ability to maintain homeothermy. And then we also have GPS collars on all of those and looking at distribution on top of all of it. So we have been working a lot with weather stations, winter weather grazing, GPS collars, those boluses I mentioned, the thermal imagery, and we're really trying to dive in on some of this weather nutrient status. Believe it or not, the last time the NRC, the beef NRC, evaluated and updated their effects of environment on cattle nutrition and nutritional requirements was in the 1980s. They do make comments in there about wind and precipitation, but those comments are really limited to that if that cow is wet, its critical temperature is at a higher temperature than one that is dry, and that wind can increase the animal's nutrient requirements. I also kind of laugh because even if they did look at like wind chill and the effects of wind chill on animal distribution or animal nutrient requirements, we don't even calculate wind chill the same way that we calculated wind chill in the 1980s. We've updated all those models. So this is something we're trying to dive into a little bit and look at, see how these technologies can be utilized to better understand cattle distribution patterns and nutrient requirements. I saved this for last. This seems to be the hot topic in technology and grazing animals, and that is virtual fence. A lot of application here. We're not doing research at Montana State per se right now on virtual fence, but we do have some partners and colleagues in Oregon State that are working with virtual fence. And I know that South Dakota State has some virtual fence work going on. But one of the biggest things that's really interesting, and as range managers, or if those of you involved with SRM know, that traditional fencing, especially on public lands, is often delayed by logistical barriers like NEPA, archaeological clearances, contracting, labor, etc. This is just some bids I think some colleagues of ours at Oregon State put together for a new fence in rangeland and forest environments. They're looking at $13,000 to $40,000 per mile of fence. So virtual fence, that technology uses behavioral modification. It's very similar to like a shock collar on a dog, or that underground fence system for a dog, but it is utilizing GPS. And then what it does is it when that animal is coming into contact with the virtual barrier that you put in place, it gives an audio cue. And then if the animal ignores that audio cue and keeps going, and then it's elicited a electrical shock. It theoretically is less logistically challenging, less labor intensive, greater management flexibility. You are able, because these are GPS collars, and as long as you have the antenna that tracks these with it, you can get semi-real-time cattle locations with these as well. And whether that's cost effective or not really depends on the situation, but I can chat a little bit about that here in a second. So virtual fence, so you can use it as a structure that serves as an enclosure where you're trying to keep the cattle confined to a certain pasture area. You can also use it as a barrier or a boundary to keep cattle out of an area. So one of the things that folks have thought about is, well, what about like sensitive riparian areas or creps or something like that? And theoretically, you could use these collars to keep them out of those locations, as well as to keep them in a pasture. So the way they work is there's a GPS unit on that collar, and it contacts the satellite system, so it knows where it's at. But to save power, because these are supposed to be designed where you can leave them on essentially all year, or at least throughout the whole grazing season, is rather than doing all the communication through the satellite, which can eat a lot of battery, you put a communication gateway out there, which I believe is one of those LoRaWAN towers or antennas, and then all of the communication with the collar happens through that LoRaWAN radio, which then transposes that to the cloud where you can use your computer. And what essentially this allows you to do, and there's some folks in Montana that have been working with this system and kind of piloting and helping with it, and they kind of joke around that, you know, I wake up in the morning, grab a cup of coffee, and sit at the computer and move my cattle. And that's essentially what you can do here. You can create boundaries. You can open a virtual gate into a new virtual pasture where the animals can walk through that gate, but they can't come back. And then you can start closing that back side of the fence to make sure that you're moving cattle through that virtual gate at some point in time. And so there's been a few studies, and I'll go through a couple of these. So here is just a response to virtual fence. And so here on the left, there's no virtual fence for 7 days, and that was the general cattle distribution in this study. They activated that virtual fence across that pasture for 10 days, and that is panel B, so you can look at the center. But then the real question is once those animals get shocked, do they have a memory? And are they not going to go back, even if you want them to? So what they did is then turn the fence off, and then within 6 days of it being deactivated, you have the virtual fence distribution, or the distribution of those animals in panel C. This is a study done at Oregon State University, and what they did is they wanted to go, okay, well, what about burned areas? What if, I think their whole premise is, what if an allotment catches fire, but it only burns, say, 25% of the allotment, but we manage it as a pasture unit. So you can't, you basically, that whole allotment pasture is going to be out of commission for the next 2 years. So could we use virtual fence as a way to graze those allotment pastures where a portion of them burned, and we just used the virtual fence to keep them out of the burned areas. And what they found is in this pasture on the right with the red hash, those are the areas that they prescribed burned. The blue dots there are animals that were given a collar, but there was no virtual fence put on. And then the white dots were ones that a virtual fence was put in, and those animals would elicit shocks if they cross that barrier. I do want to point out, like, even though this looks really good and really successful, what they found is there is an error rate, and so it is very, very successful. But I can't remember what they said. I don't remember if it's 5% or something like that. But there is some error rate, and that is either due to malfunctioning collars that just for some reason didn't work, or I always equate it to my father-in-law's dog. Like, you can put a shock collar on that thing and shock it, but she just keeps running. So there's just some behavioral issues that could be a part of that as well. I thought I had another slide in here, but about virtual fence. I think they've been actually working on virtual fence to contain animals, potentially to see if you can use those virtual fences to create like a natural fire break on rangelands in case of wildfire. And I know they've been working on that and getting that published, and I can't remember if that's come through or not, but yeah, I would really keep your eyes out, because that's an interesting paper in itself. So with that, I'll stop, and I'd be happy to take any questions, or I do have some data slides for any data junkies out there that really want to see how these models work, but if not, we can just talk technology applications.
Maybe I'll cut the silence. You didn't mention much about monitoring greenhouse gases with some of these technologies. Have you seen a lot of that, in your discipline? I'm from Canada, by the way, and we are kind of looking at those kind of technologies.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good thing to bring up. So the same company that produces those supplement trailers that I was showing also create a system they call green feed, where essentially you can put this system out and you entice cattle into it with some kind of supplement. And then as they eat that supplement, it's measuring greenhouse gas exchange. So there is that system. It seems to be one of the more popular ones. In the stuff I've been looking at, there's some other systems. I saw one out there that it was kind of bizarre, but it could work for at least a research application, where they use a halter, and then there's like this little vacuum cleaner that kind of comes over the top of the nose, and it just has a fan in there, and it's sucking up the cattle gas exchange, and then you can take that cartridge and quantify that. I haven't seen it used in a research sense. I think most folks are using either like a gas exchange chamber, or they're using that green feed system. But I'm trying to think too. I have not seen yet where folks are doing that on rangelands and rangeland grazing scenarios, but I do know of a couple colleagues who have some proposals out to start doing that work now. Most of it right now, I think, has been done more controlled, low quality forage diets, and looking at exchanges that way.
Yeah, sounds about the same as what we have up here. We're starting to see those trailers where the cattle can walk in and we can catch a sample of their breath. But But I guess more of what I've seen maybe over the last 10 years is using the sort of the meteorological stations and putting methane sensors and carbon dioxide sensors up there. But each one of those costs a small fortune.
Yeah.
And but man, it gets some interesting results if those results can be considered reliable.
Yeah, I have seen some folks who do a lot of like the environmental biophysics, and maybe even soil chemistry kind of stuff, use those towers that have the meters on them and stuff like that. But I think the one piece I think that they'll fall short on is you can maybe look at general changes in methane based on some kind of pasture management treatment maybe, but it'd be really hard to identify what kind of cattle attributes or specific cattle attributes, like which cattle are emitting those methanes, and is there attributes that differ across the cattle in the herd, which ones are efficient, which ones aren't. You'd just be looking at more of like a gross environmental scale change in methane versus being able to identify where it's coming from.
Yeah,
And
for
those-
methane, it's been pretty easy. Like when the cows are in the vicinity of the tower, it's like spike.
Mhm.
But to get the true magnitude might be a bit tricky because you have to, there's a limited footprint of the sensor. And I mean, on rangeland, we're talking miles of area here, whereas the towers, depending on how tall you put them, you can only get, if the cows are within 100 meters and stay within 100 meters, you can get a pretty accurate reading, but they don't stay within 100 meters.
Yeah.
Even 50 meters, I think, is ours.
Yeah, I think that green feed system with the like on a trailer or some kind of mobile is probably the best that's out there that I'm aware of right now, in terms of, then you can look at, well, which cows are emitting the most methane. Is there some kind of attribute about those cows that are different than others? Or it'd be interesting to then correlate that to like GPS collar information and go, okay, which animals are emitting the most methane, and how did their distribution patterns or behavior change from the others? And there's a lot of researchable questions there, but there's some challenges too. You got to get the animal to eat in the trailer as well, so it takes some training and some things like that before they get really dialed into it.
Yeah, and depending on your formulation, like and what's available to them on the pasture, we're finding a lot of them just aren't eating their allocation of mineral.
Yep.
They're not taking it in, at least not to the recommended amounts. So what's going on there, hey?
Yeah, and that's something really interesting we have been able to capture with the trailers in general, is that we see a huge impact on the forage production, and more specifically forage quality. So essentially season of use on the impact of animal supplementation intake. And so what we found is that when the grass is green and growing and is good quality, you'll watch your intakes drop pretty substantially. But as soon as that starts senescing and turning brown and losing some of that protein value, you'll see them starting to rely on that protein supplement quite a bit. And I've read in some of the literature that they saw pretty similar responses with mineral intake as well.
Sam, we got a couple questions in the chat here. Rose is asking, have you seen cattle change their grazing patterns as they age? This should be right up your alley.
Yeah, man, Rose. Yeah, I have. Actually, that was actually part of my PhD dissertation, was looking at just what we did is we stratified GPS collars across several different age groups of cattle. We ran those resource use models and those maps for each of these age classes, or we actually ran just how does the herd move, and we found huge variation. So like how animals use topography aspects, or just terrain in general, or how far they travel from water, how far they travel from supplement. Like we saw these huge variation. And so we went into that and did some modeling based on those animals' ages. And it turns out that an animal's age and experience on rangeland has a pretty profound impact on how they distribute across that landscape. I think, give me just a second here. I blew this up. I can show you. Yeah, so this is kind of a complicated way to look at it, but those are looking at age classifications on the x-axis and those animal selection coefficients. So if it's a positive selection coefficient, then they select for something, and if it's negative, they select against it. So like, for instance, in the elevation, we saw that the younger animals selected against elevation while the older animals selected for it. Distance to supplement, we saw that. So basically what this is showing is that the older animals were more willing to go further away from water in higher elevations and further away from supplement.
We got another one. Kelsey asked, are you aware of any researchers using some of these technologies to evaluate potential genetic cattle behaviors such as pasture distribution or RFI?
I do actually, and I'm trying to think. I don't know whatever happened to it, but I was at the I go to the national animal science meetings, and there were some presentations there out of Colorado State that were teamed with Dr. Derek Bailey, looking at some of the GPS data that they've collected and seeing if there's any correlations to any genetic markers. I think they were finding some genetic markers that seem to be correlated, but in terms of like selecting for those kind of markers and things like that, I don't think any work has been done with that. I know that Dr. Jim Sprinkle out of University of Idaho has been doing some grazing distribution with RFI stuff in summer grazing allotments, and he seems to be finding some effects. We did some similar work here in winter grazing environments, and we didn't really see a whole lot, but so he's been doing some. And then I think there's some stuff that's being that's a topic of discussion that's starting to gain some traction. Is there genetic markers that relate to how animals utilize landscape? So I'd keep your eyes open in the next few years, because I think some of that's starting to pop up.
I've got a question for you, Sam.
Yeah.
So as a manager, what can I take away from this and go apply tomorrow?
Yeah, I'm actually glad you mentioned this, because I actually meant to add a slide into that GPS component that I completely airheaded until about the time I logged in and realized it wasn't there. So a lot of this GPS stuff that I've been showing you is like GPS collars, research grade type stuff. They're big, bulky, and they're pretty expensive. So it's not something you generally work with, but there's several companies out there now. I can think of 3 off the top of my head that have now created solar charged GPS ear tags. And so there's a company called Movement with MOO that's based out of Australia, but they are now in the United States. They use these ear tags. They have a GPS collar or a GPS ear tag, and they have just a activity ear tag. But they're 100% designed with the producer in mind, and so they're looking at being able to either ear tag a percentage of your animals, all your animals. Maybe you want to ear tag your bulls, so you don't have to spend a day and a half searching for your bulls out in an allotment. But that, as long as those ear tags come within a one of those radio towers, similar to what those virtual collars do, then it'll give you that animal's location. There's another company out there and I'm not as familiar with the movements interface, but there's another company based out of South Dakota called 701X. They also have a very similar system, but their ear tags, I think, operate off of a cellular system. So, and they log the data. So when those animals hit any kind of cell service, it then uploads the data, I believe. And with those ear tags actually comes some serious record keeping technologies. And so they have a general commercial herd and a registered herd, and you'd have to look them up. It's pretty intense what they've done. But one of the things I thought was interesting is for like the registered herd subscription, you can download this app on your phone, and when you're out calving and a calf hits the ground, you can tag it, do calving ease score, all those kinds of scores, and you can open the app right on your phone, and you can enter all that data, and as soon as you hit cell service again, it'll upload that, and then it'll keep that data available for you so that you can export that data straight to, I believe they said you can export it straight to a breed association for breed association registration, things like that. So there are some companies out there that are doing stuff right now. One thing I meant to say about the virtual fence system that I thought was really interesting is they've actually kind of gone away from just the point dots on a map and are actually creating these like movable heat maps of how these animals are distributing within the last 24 hours or whatever parameter you set to. So it's kind of looking at more of like a use across the pasture versus just dots on a map. And so that's an interesting aspect. But yeah, there's several things out there that could be done. I guess I didn't. One thing I'll throw out about the virtual fence too is that fence system was just purchased by Merck Animal Health. And so they're very vested in that system as well. But their price point was pretty cheap. I want to say they would give you a collar. They would lease you a collar for a year for $35. And I want to say that the antenna you had to buy, and those ran about $10,000. But they could be used for long term, and actually you can even mount those to a trailer and move them with your cattle. And so when you think of the cost of building fence, it could pencil out. But now that Merck has purchased them, I don't know what their price point is. I heard that it's gone up a little bit, but I couldn't tell you where. But yeah, there's these technologies, a lot of these are available on a commercial aspect. The one caveat I try to tell folks is the technology in the livestock industry is blowing up really fast, and kind of keep a mindful eye. If something seems too good to be true, it might be. There's so many of these companies that are popping up and new. It's hard to know if they're vetted technologies or if it's somebody just trying to sell you an idea that they had, and that company won't exist in the next couple of years. So go in with a mindful eye, take your time, do some researching, but there are some pretty interesting producer applications out there available now.
Good. Well, thanks, Sam. We got time for one final question. Jeff Mosley in the chat asked, with virtual fence, you mentioned cows can't go back through a gate. If the virtual fence is used to create a boundary and the cow crosses the boundary, can the cow return to where it is supposed to be?
You say, yeah, the answer, the way I understand it, like I said, I haven't played with them too much, but I've had a lot of discussions. And the way I understand it is if an animal gets out of the boundary, it can come back in. So the boundaries are basically one-way gates, if you will. So if you get out, you can come back in without getting shocked. But if he comes back in and then goes to leave again, it will reactivate and she will get shocked. So that works. And then with those gates, you can set any kind of gate you want, I believe. So you can have a two-way gate where I guess the animal can go back and forth until you activate the fence. You can have it to where it can go through but can't come back. I think there's a lot of different applications of how you put these fences together and what you can do with them.
Very good. Well, that about does it for our time today. Thanks everyone for joining us. And thank you, Sam, for doing this presentation. This was helpful and informative.
Thanks, Noah. Thanks for having me.